Welcome to the Transformations Podcast. Here, guests and I will share our transformative experiences and will explore how to find excellence in life.
Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wiley. It was very nice of you to invite me to share some mutual experiences we've had over the years.
I wanted to start out by talking about jumping into something in the middle before we hit the beginning, is that you had traveled to maybe a dozen countries, and you can correct me in a moment, and that was all brought through the Institute of Noetic Sciences?
Actually, the funding was handled through the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I had met a psychiatrist on the East Coast, affiliated with the Rockefeller family, actually, and had discussed my interest in doing an investigation of Asian martial arts in terms of its spiritual and healing components, and proposed an idea of traveling there and trying to collect information in the form of interviews, videotape various practices that were done, impressions, and a lot of that stemmed from the fact that I didn't find any of this in the United States. We had the physical forms and the physical practices, but virtually nothing was known about the healing practices, and the spiritual components were sort of more anecdotal about personages in the martial arts.
I think when most people think about meditative traditions or spiritual, they think of Tai Chi or Aikido or something like that, of the softer arts, but they don't think about them in terms of Filipino Eskrima and Thai boxing and, Korean martial arts. But these are all arts that were covered in your paper that you did for the Journal of Asian Martial Arts and then in your book, Spiritual Dimensions of the Martial Arts. I wonder how you got the idea that these types of meditative, spiritual healing practices existed in countries where that kind of information was not in the literature.
At the time that I was interested in this, I was practicing martial arts. I'd always had an interest in it. I had practiced the typical sports that you would find in the United States when I was in high school and some in college, team sports, primarily in the form of basketball, baseball, football. I always had an interest and sort of an admiration of athletic endeavors that involve more than the traditional team sport. I was always impressed by the kind of movements, the body movements that gymnasts would make, and so I was sort of interested in gymnastics, which was my first athletic endeavor. I was always fascinated by martial arts. I'd hear stories about them. There was more sort of a mystical component that was described. People able to perform movements, stunts, things that people said were impossible. I was just impressed by the fact that there was this extended human performance that was above and beyond what one would normally think in some sort of athletic activity. And at the time that I became interested in it, I remember in high school, and this is in the late 60s, there was one fellow in my school who was a senior who was traveled to Boston, which was about an hour's distance away, to learn judo. And outside of that, there were no other schools teaching martial arts anywhere in the area where I lived. There were no karate schools, and it wasn't until I actually went to Chicago graduate school that I actually encountered a lot of the martial arts that I had never been able to see before because they weren't in the location geographically where I was living.
We'll talk about Chicago and the Degerberg Academy, which we both have a connection with, in a bit. I want to take a little sidetrack and then get back because you had mentioned gymnastics. And one point we had a conversation 20, 25 years ago, who knows, and we were talking about Brazilian capoeira. You were saying, if they just learned some of the body discipline or postures of the gymnasts, their movements could be, more precise, cleaner.
I would use the words further refined.
Further refined.
Yeah.
Right.
At that time, there were people were studying physical movements and biomechanical principles that were involved in performing certain gymnastics activities or stunts or movements. That I don't believe that was allowed for capoeira at the time, and even now I don't know if in fact there are people who have for advanced training in biomechanics that would have studied those forms in the same way that they did with gymnastics back in the late 60s and early 70s.
You went around, when was that, in the late 80s or early 90s on your travels?
The major trip to Asia was in I believe it was in 1990. Prior to that, I had been studying a number of different martial arts. You mentioned the Degerberg Academy in Chicago.
Right.
I ended up getting my first exposure to a lot of these Asian traditions that otherwise I wouldn't have had access to. It was they began the seminar format for the first time, and so you have encountered people that were able to teach some of the basic movements that were involved with this. And given the fact that I had heard, in terms of earlier readings, that there were these healing components and spiritual components, I had the first opportunity to meet with a lot of these people and ask if in fact these so-called practices actually existed. A lot of them had informed me that indeed they existed, but that not many of their students had an interest in it. They were more interested in learning the self-defense aspects, the physical performance. And so I was actually going into an area that people really hadn't had an interest in exploring.
I can see that. And my own interest coming up watching in the 80s in the Kung Fu movies that played here in the U.S. from Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest, there was always the herbalist, the bone setter, the healer, a master that maybe meditated and floated. All these things were fascinating to me as a 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old when I started at age 9. But all those things captivated me, and I always wanted to learn them and thought they were part of everything, but then you find out they're not. And you have to travel for that, as we've both done. You going out on your trip, you had been involved in meditation. In addition to the meditation, you had also been involved in the Indian tradition of Shaktipat transmission. Now, which came first for you? Was it the meditation or going to one of the Shaktipat events with like Muktananda or somebody?
Well, I was more interested in meditation in general. Mm-hmm. I remember being a senior in college, and I came across the classic work by Charlie Tart, Altered States of Consciousness, and It was a collection of essays and research studies that appeared in various journals, magazines, and it was sort of my first exposure to kind of seeing what was being done and what kind of areas of interest were part of this sort of emerging new field of consciousness studies. At that time, they had different divisions. There were people studying daydreaming, dreams, altered states of consciousness associated with drugs and psychedelics, hypnosis. Meditation was another component that was out there. Reading about these things, it just struck me as kind of fascinating, and I was interested in learning more about it. To put this in proper perspective, the Shaktipat thing is something that came a little bit later. It's sort of it's a particular technique used within certain traditions of Indian yoga, primarily, that supposedly are an avenue to try to experience the farther reaches of consciousness. They would often term it as being enlightenment. And this was just one technique of many that composed the whole program of yoga.
You started meditating first. That was the first thing, looking into the altered states of consciousness. The book by Charles Tart is an absolute classic. There's also the out-body experiences in the books by Robert Monroe.
Let me point out also, when I was doing this, there were not a hell of a lot of people doing research in that area, but I haven't had an opportunity when I started my graduate studies to meet a lot of these people. One of the earliest encounters of meeting people who were interested in this area was held at the Menninger Foundation. And they had this program called Council Groves. And basically, it was an opportunity for an entire week, people would sit and give presentations in an informal way on all of these different topics, with research they were doing, practices they were pursuing, and it was the first time that you actually encountered face-to-face a lot of the folks that were investigating these things. For example, I did meet Bob Monroe when he was first coming out, about the same time that his book was published. Charles Tart I met early on. So meeting the people in person, above and beyond just reading about their studies, was really kind of an unusual opportunity. And it was very helpful in terms of looking at the depth of these things and kind of getting a a perspective of, how does this relate to me and what kinds of experiences am I looking to encounter?
For me, those kinds of experiences we're talking about that I wanted to encounter from the fantastical life that I imagined that was going to be in front of me as I grew up, and maybe, looking to escape reality a bit from my home life, was always something like astral travel, out-of-body experience, being able to kinetically move objects or psychically read minds, travel to other places, bilocate, remote view. What are the kinds of experiences that you were hoping or looking to develop at that time?
Actually, I really wasn't that interested in the paranormal. I mean, the paranormal was kind of interesting from an intellectual point of view. I remember it was sort of my sophomore year in college that I first encountered the writings of Abraham Maslow, who was famous as a humanistic psychologist and often identified with the discipline of self-actualization. It was in 1954, whatever, he had done a study of people he encountered, both historical, some he met personally, some who were still alive. They'd had a certain criteria of developing themselves as individuals above and beyond the norm of adjustment to reality, for lack of a better word. At that time that he was writing, psychology from a clinical standpoint was primarily looking at pathology, schizophrenia, paranoia, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, and we were looking at the abnormal aspects of human behavior, classifying them, trying to find treatment interventions for them. There were very few people looking at the positive elements, that something could go beyond normality. And Maslow was one of the first people to really kind of coin that. And I was actually fascinated by reading about his chapter on self-actualizing people. I think a book that he had written, and we had a chapter on, was called Motivation and Personality. He came of a traditional research background. Initially, his work was with animal studies, and then he broadened it into this other area, and basically was one of the founders of humanistic psychology. What was it that these people, as self-actualizing people, experienced? But I was more interested in sort of like, what's that mind state about? What's that kind of level of existence all about? So that was my first inkling of this thing. So my interest in the meditation was, what is out there that related to what Maslow was talking about, and was there more to it? I had a meeting with famous psychologist, now deceased, David McClellan, who was very famous in terms of looking at motivation and what were the needs of an organism or an individual that motivates them to pursue different things. And I remember meeting with him, and in the latter part of his life, he had developed an interest in meditation. I don't know that he practiced it himself. And I remember him sitting down and asking me, like, what motivates you to have an interest in doing this? And my answer was basically, I'm looking at seeing what are the larger and more advanced aspects of this kind of life experience. And today I'd phrase it as consciousness. And I remember he was kind of curious as to what would motivate me, because none of this had really been an interest in terms of earlier studies that have been dealing with motivation or whatever, to my knowledge. What were these states of consciousness or experience one would encounter? And obviously you had to practice them to try to understand and experience what it was really all about.
It's like you hear about these guys in Tibet, in India, in Nepal, in the Himalayas, who have these high levels of enlightenment, self-actualization, ability to do things. It's almost like they have to live their whole life like that to get it. They have to do the practices. They have to be austere. It's almost like you've got to commit to that or nothing. I mean, is that what you found with this?
Well, initially, when I read about this, I mean, you would read the stories of the kinds of things, the ascetic practices, and primarily in yoga, which I first encountered, were do these exercises or whatever that would allow them to encounter these more advanced experiences. I think the one that most was emphasized was trying to become one with the universe or one with God, achieve a universal consciousness, become one with reality, where their sense of ego or self would merge with this larger ground of existence or whatever. I'm using very loose terminology here. Basically, it was something above and beyond the normal, regular way of functioning in terms of how we think, feel, behave, how we move, whatever. So, but I would read about these things as being, people had to sacrifice a lot. The stories you would read about would be more the sacrifices, lying on a bed of nails, starving yourself, remaining in fixed postures for hours or days at a time, concentration, and something where you sort of like had the intentionality of pursuing things to an extreme degree in order to affect some change in your mind, your body, and how you experience the spiritual dimension.
What you're saying is like sitting in a fixed position, an extreme degree, and you hear about the yogis who are just regular people, Sadhguru among them, who are just hanging around one day, and next thing you know, they wake up and there's 1,000 people sitting around them, and they'd been sitting cross-legged for a week or 2 weeks without even knowing it and realizing it. They went into some deep state of samadhi, or even without trying, something came to them and took over them. And for it to take, they had to remain in place. You found in your research, which goes against a lot of the literature here in the United States around meditation, is that, to become enlightened, you've got to meditate and count your hours for decades. And I know that there's an instant enlightenment. There's a fast one, and there's the slow one. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is one thing that I kind of always I found interesting, and I wrote about early on. Well, if you want to learn how to swing a bat and hit a baseball, you basically are introduced to the bat, the grip, the foot stance, the body movements. You observe how some people sort of train to learn how to develop a very simple, it's not a simple task, but a basic task of learning how to hit a ball with a bat. And it's a stage, it's basically a series of stages where you slowly learn various techniques and postures in order to accomplish this particular skill. It's a gradual thing. It's not something where you immediately step up at the plate and, okay, so throw the ball at me and I'm going to swing and hit it. And you're guided through it in a slow, gradual fashion. That's how most people learn meditation. Historically, it was the concept that there is sort of an end goal of some sort that represents the culmination of an extended practice. The deeper you go within that particular practice in terms of performing various techniques leads you to a certain state of awareness, sense of expanded awareness. Right. It's a gradualistic thing. It's sort of common sense that it would be that way. But I also remember reading at the time, and again, nobody had an interest in this. I'm reading about, again, I went to as much of the classical literature as I could. I had a position in South Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. I had access to people who knew the languages, who lived in these countries. So it was like an exposure to learning more about these techniques and about these practices. I remember reading about these things and finding out that there are many variations on this gradualistic meditation practice format. Again, the dominant feature at this point is slow practice, gradual practice, and over time, you achieve a certain goal. At least that's the ideal. Basically, people, the first thing they say, well, I went to such and such a country, and I've been practicing this for 30, 40, 50 years, and so people automatically assume if he spent that many years doing it, that obviously he's got to be pretty advanced, and it does take a long time in order to reach that level of development. When I started exploring these things, there are many variations on this gradualistic path. And again, that still is the dominant path. It's the only one that makes sense to a lot of people, and it actually is kind of commonsensical when you think about it. I mean, gradual practice leading to gradual enlightenment over a period of time. You could have the experience of sudden enlightenment, where you're doing all these practices, and all of a sudden it's sort of like a burst through, but it happens spontaneously as a result of the practice that you performed earlier. So you can have gradual practice leading to enlightenment. You can have sudden enlightenment. You can have, after you've had sort of this dramatic experience, you could have cultivation, where you try to sort of like pull it all together. You don't necessarily have to have practiced it for an extended period of time in order to have an experience. Right. Some people have had experiences in a very short period of time. Some even have had it without even having done any meditative practice. Something just sort of happens to them, and they're transformed in a certain way. So there are different ways in which this all unfolds.
What you're saying reminds me of child prodigies in music. You know, I took piano lessons at the age of 5, and at the age of 17, I couldn't hardly play anything, you know. I hit a certain level, and it was my ceiling. No matter how badly I wanted to be Billy Joel or read more notes, I couldn't play more things. My fingers just couldn't do it. But you have these kids who are 6 years old, and they're playing symphonies on the violin, on the piano. It's almost like they had instantaneous enlightenment of the music. How else can you explain that? There has to be something that's wired into the brain or the consciousness that allows a spontaneous enlightenment or a spontaneous skill to come forward. So if we look at it that way, that instantaneous.
The way in which the experience of meditation unfolds is different in different approaches. The most common approach is what we would call progressive changes in consciousness. That is usually considered, with the majority of meditative traditions that are out there, that it's probably the most common format. But then you have a different phenomenological flavor, which describes the way of sudden enlightenment. There are certain schools of Zen, for example, that emphasize that you can have the spontaneous experience as part of the practice. Then you have variations on the theme of what we call sudden versus gradual enlightenment. You can have, as an example, you can have a sudden enlightenment, a very dramatic experience, and then that's followed by gradual cultivation. So you have this experience, and then you have to kind of work it into your system so that even though you're leading an ordinary life, there's a way in which you have to kind of integrate that in terms of normal pre-enlightenment experiences in terms of as compared to afterwards. And so it takes time to sort of integrate it. You can have sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. You can have sudden enlightenment and sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation. So there are variations on this theme that basically nobody has really looked at in great depth across the spectrum. Vipassana was the first tradition that was brought over here in terms of information about what was going on in the East, and I think it's one of the most sophisticated and highly developed meditative traditions of any that you could choose that we're aware of at this point in time.
And just so some listeners may not know, Vipassana is insight meditation, correct?
Right. Benny, one of the earlier writings on this topic described there are two paths to meditation. One was what they would call concentrative meditation, and the other path was one of insight. And then you had systems that involved both concentration and insight.
Right.
The insight, I'm very loose with these terms because they vary in different contexts. But the insight is more sort of reflection and analysis of these things, as opposed to focusing, for example, on the flame on the end of a candle, which was pure concentration as an exercise. And so it was very natural that the gradualistic path would proceed, because Vipassana was not a tradition where you would have sudden experiences as dramatically as you would with other traditions, which emphasize more of the sudden enlightenment kind of experience.
One thing that I see, and you may agree with me, is that people are stuck in this mindfulness movement. It's like, here's one way to meditate. Let's practice mindfulness, and there are many ways to practice it, but they never get out of the mindfulness practice. So it's almost like if you've been doing it 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, you're not going to get better at mindfulness. You have to do something different than being stuck in the one part. It's my assessment that if you haven't reached the goal in a decade or two, or that you're feeling like you're going toward it, you've got to take a different practice. What are your thoughts on that?
It really took off. It was like, it was something very novel and very new. I mean, people would often hear the term concentration, and you'd have to concentrate when you're in class, in your classroom, and concentrate in sports or any kind of athletic or academic activity. Mindfulness brought a different flavor to it. It's something new to the Western way of thinking. And this was, I think, the one that celebrated it or advanced it the most was John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts. And he developed a program that involved learning some basic mindfulness techniques combined with some yoga techniques to try to improve physical maladies, different medical conditions, emotional states, involve it and trying to introduce it into a psychotherapeutic format, introduce it into pain management, whereas prior to that, basically people were only taking pain medications as an example to counter pain.
Right.
So it become very, very popular. It's some people have described it as sort of becoming sort of the McDonald's of meditation, because it's everywhere now. It's everywhere now.
Well, when I look at the spectrum of mind states, I mean, we have mindless, people who just can't stop thinking, and they're full of anxiety, and they're always worrying. And then you have mindfulness, where instead of concentrating, maybe the word we could use is attention, right? They're putting their attention on the sensation on the tip of their nose when they're breathing,
right,
or
right.
navel moving down, or whatever it is. But it seems like seen as the only or the ultimate practice, and people are stuck there. But I don't think through that they're going to get to the next stage, which is no mind or mindless, right? And in the martial art traditions, no mind in the Japanese tradition, Mushin, has been ingrained for quite a while. And I know, so if we wrap this back to your research and going to these different countries, you can see that these physical traditions have the no mind, where the static, mental-only meditative practices seem to focus on the mindful. Would you agree with that statement?
Virtually all of the martial arts at the most advanced levels stress the importance of emptying the mind of all thoughts.
Right.
Entering into a state of what they call no mind. You find that they've borrowed some of this stuff from the Zen practices, certain Zen sects, certain Zen practices. But in order to, this is what's critical. I think the martial arts, of everything that I've seen in terms of different athletic endeavors, the Asian martial arts have done more investigation and more in-depth analysis of mind-body experiences than perhaps any other physical activity. And if you look at what they say, they're not emphasizing, they do emphasize the importance of concentration. They do emphasize the importance of being mindful. But if you look at the highest and advanced components of practice, they say that you have to achieve a level of no mind in execution of movements, particularly if you're in a combative scenario. If you stick with either just concentrating, say, on watching somebody's punch, or if they have weapons, they're going to strike you with a certain weapon. If you focus solely on that element, you're going to end up being defeated, because you cannot just be localized to just one area. You can be mindful of the fact that you have an opponent in front of you. But if in fact you're in a situation, life or death, or advanced practice in terms of some kind of competition, if you remain in either the concentrative or the mindfulness level, you're going to be defeated. If in fact your opponent goes into a no mind. And by that I mean subconsciously he experiences things a priori to which is going to unfold in the future, and has insight in terms of countering a particular movement or performing a particular exercise that consciously he may not remember after he's performed it. It has to be subliminal. If you're not subliminal, you've missed it. It means that you're still functioning in essentially a slightly expanded state of awareness, because you're heightened in a defensive or in an attack mode in a particular combative context or competitive context. But if you remain focused with either the concentration or the mindfulness, and you don't take that next step, you're going to lose. And that's why every one of these traditions, even those that really don't emphasize the spiritual components, I don't think you'll find any very, very advanced teacher that will not stress the importance of no-mindness, of reaching that moment. And it's momentary. It's not permanent. It's a shift above and beyond. It's like, or nitrous oxide in a classic car. You push the button, you shoot forward. That's the same kind of idea that the no-mind component allows to enter into your consciousness, and which allows you to overcome the traditional limitations that you've had with a more lower level area of functioning. Sense what this
what we're talking about here really is a level deeper and higher than what sports scientists call being in the zone. Because when you're on the football field or playing hockey and you're in the zone, you're carrying the ball down, you're at a heightened level state of awareness, but you're also having to be aware of everyone and everything around you. You don't have that no-mind state yet. It's like a level below, I would think.
I can put it in terms of psychological terms. One of the fellows who was on my dissertation committee was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he's the fellow that developed the idea of flow experience. Flow experience is very common, so commonly associated with being in the zone.
Right.
I contrast that with Maslow. Maslow talked about peak experiences. Peak experiences are not necessarily the same as a flow experience. The peak experience is something that's sort of more elevated. They're both elevated, but in a different way. There's a sense of transcendence that has spiritual or religious overtones with the peak experience, if you read the original stuff that Maslow wrote about. Again, but if you compare that to flow experience, which is also very powerful, they're different, and they tend to overlap, and they can also be integrated. Most of the people that I see when they're talking about being in the zone, the martial arts was you have to be primed in a life and death situation, and in those contexts, if especially if you're using weapons like in the Filipino martial arts, where the movements are much faster with the weapons than just the hand movements, and with potential catastrophic experiences in terms of being injured or cut, it heightens you on a level that you have to take that other step. It's not just kind of flowing with the opponent. They do have drills, as you and I both know, where you can kind of flow with the rhythm, but it's a whole different thing if you want to take it to the other level. And the vast majority of martial arts practices that you find, particularly in the West, especially the things that dominate the media, the social media, YouTube or whatever, most of them do not emphasize the no-mind component at all. And for that reason, it remains fixated and limited in terms of achieving the higher levels of that particular art.
We draw a parallel in our experience, Mike. You travel to a bunch of countries, quite a few, studying martial meditative traditions, researching them. I also went out and spent quite a bit of time traveling through 6, 7, 8, 9 countries, studying martial traditions, healing traditions in the martial arts and the healing arts of those countries. And today, we jump forward 20, 30 years from that experience, that research that we did. Most of what we find in the martial arts today is void of all of that. Mostly the martial arts is concerned about sport competition like MMA, jiu-jitsu, which is also an ego boosting. There's not much spiritual thing there, no healing tradition there, very little meditative there. A few people here and there may do it. Thai boxing, Taekwondo has become a family art for kids and devoid of that. Judo is almost non-existent. It was like the first big art to come around, and you can't even find a judo school anymore. Even the Filipino stuff, which was, very sword, dagger, knife, stick, new and different and dangerous in the day, is now just built up of drills with moving the weapons with wrists instead of full body and arm and power, so that danger is removed. And this is how the martial arts has become massive, all these arts across the world. But most of those things we're talking about don't exist in the classes, clubs, and schools at all. These higher level practices are still not embraced.
You're correct. This is the problem. You and I did all of this research before the internet came out. We had to kind of search these people out, make the connections. It would take years at times to meet with somebody. You didn't have social media where you could call them up. A lot of these countries didn't even have telephone access. Or you send a letter, and hopefully in India you get a letter back in a month. What's happened is, as the media has become more influential, the level of depth of martial arts, and I would also say in a lot of cases with meditation, at least the way it's presented on the internet, superficial. It's shallow. There's no depth. Parallel with martial arts and meditation is the same. Certain traditions, I think, which do aim to get to the depth of things, but I'm going to say that the vast majority of what I see on the internet, including people who have established a well-known reputation for themselves, most of the stuff remains relatively superficial. In order to get to the depth of something, you're going to have to take a different approach to it. You're going to recognize the limitation of what's being taught.
Yeah, I think it was the problem before, too, because even when we were going out and doing our field work, there were very few practitioners to find to demonstrate it and talk about it, and they had very few students.
Correct.
Right? So today, there's still very few deep practitioners with very few students, but the world is now overwhelmed with mediocrity of the arts. It's like everything just regressed to the mean, to use a psychological term, So it's very hard to find good teachers, good quality content, literature, and studies on these. I want to bring up a few things from your research that I think our audience would like to hear about. Okay, so number one, I remember looking at your early fieldwork tape. I'm going to say 2 words, and you tell the story. QiGong snake.
when I was trying to do all this study, I was trying to get videotapes of people that had demonstrated unusual physical abilities, be it healing or some kind of physical performance or some kind of action or movement associated with a traditional martial art. In the 1980s, the Chinese government was trying to round up a lot of their martial arts practitioners and masters of these arts because they viewed it as a national heritage. The same way that in America at the time we think of baseball or football as sort of a national pastime as a sport. The Chinese basically viewed martial arts with the same level or even a higher level of recognition and identification with their culture. So I remember them, they sort of like went throughout the country and coerced a lot of these traditional masters to come out of the small rural areas and to demonstrate a lot of these practices, which they would then videotape and store in their archives. And I ended up hearing about this gentleman who performed an unusual snake performance and an unusual ability to extend energy above and beyond your traditional understanding of energy in the body. But there was a gentleman there that obviously in a rural area, small crowd around him, and he had a live snake that he was holding in his hand, and he then proceeded to take the snake and swallow the snake live, and at the same time he was chugging down some kind of alcoholic beverage to sort of assist with his swallowing the snake. I think this came out of the Taoist philosophy where they felt that the inner mystical physiology that the Taoists had was that there were certain techniques that you could learn through energy practices and use of herbs that could counter any kind of poison from impacting on you that would lead to you to be severely impaired or die. So he demonstrated this technique of swallowing the snake. As soon as he finished that, he then did practicing some slow movements or whatever, and he had a group of people from the audience line up in sort of 3 different guys standing in front of one another, each separated by about 3 feet apart, and he's behind this line of 3 individuals. So he does sort of deep breathing techniques, slow movements, slow crouching downs at a low posture level. 3 men in front of him, they're facing away from him. He's behind them. And as he does this, the 3rd guy at the farthest end passes out, falls down, almost looking lifeless. The 2 guys behind him remain standing like they're just sort of looking around in front of themselves and showing no unusual movements or reaction. So the guy at the very end, the 3rd guy furthest most away, which I'm going to say is probably about 10 or 15 feet away, has fallen down unconscious. So he rushes up to this fellow and does some movements with his arms as if he's directing energy in this gentleman's body to resuscitate him. He had passed out completely. So essentially the image that you get is this guy had developed this energy in his body in such a way that he could have the energy pass through 2 individuals, but that his goal was to have the 3rd person furthest most away be impacted by the energy and fall unconscious, which is what was demonstrated on the tape.
So we're talking about like an internal alchemy, as the Taoists would call it. And you think that him swallowing the snake kind of...
I think that was a symbolic gesture. I think it was a symbolic thing that he was able to counter the influence of poisons. Again, remember the Taoists had these rituals where people who actually swallowed some of these elixirs that they said could counter, I think they used the word cinnabar field, which was part of the Tantien area. Well, cinnabar is poisonous. And I remember reading in some of these texts that some of these guys would swallow the cinnabar thinking that they would be able to counter the influence of it by associating the symbolic reference to the actual product. They ended up dying. Symbolism versus actual physical ingredients.
Right.
So, again, I think he was demonstrating this, that he developed a certain amount of skill. The energy in his body was able to counter the influence of eating a poisonous snake. And then he wanted to demonstrate the external component of his practice, which was to knock somebody unconscious that was 15 feet away and going through 2 human bodies before he had that impact. That was probably one of the more extreme things that I think I've seen.
So that's, projection of energy and having it stop an effect where you want it to stop an effect.
Exactly.
If that's real, that's some high-level stuff, man. You know, newborns in their bassinets or whatever, and with glass or, you know, plastic in front of, you know, separating the room, and the QiGong master putting his hand through the glass or the plastic, a hole in it, and using the qi well above the infant's body, and the infants, like, their hands are moving, the legs are moving, he's turning them upside down and sideways, being quite a foot or two away from them, and separated through this space that's transparent so we can see what's going on. But, you know, there's no strings, there's no nothing. I mean, that shows the ability to connect your energy field with another and to manipulate it at a very base level, whereas the guy shooting it through two people 15 feet and making them pass out is an extreme level.
Yeah, well, I remember at the time that I was doing all this research, there were Japanese documentaries and tapes which showed young infants, several months old only,
right,
you know, in a crib, and you're having the QiGong master outside of them, and the children's legs and arm movements are responding to the movements of the QiGong master. Some of them, they weren't even looking at him. And again, too young to really respond to some of the movements that were demonstrated. It certainly was a strong impact visually to see that, in fact, you could get the young infant to move their legs, shake their legs, when the QiGong master behind them is pointing his hand at the legs from a distance of several
right.
feet, and they're affecting that kind of thing. So, yeah, that was less dramatic, but certainly the same kind of principle.
Still, we don't see that every day. I mean, you know, we don't see people moving other people's body limbs around.
Well, that's true, but you also have the QiGong masters that are able to get bulls to, remember that we saw some tapes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You get the QiGong or the Tai Chi master in with a group of bulls, you know, enclosed in a certain area, and they're able to perform these movements, and you get the animals to basically fall down.
Right, to fall over.
Fall over, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's and you're not even seeing them, the performer performing, in some cases, even any specific strong movements.
No,
but you still get this.
They're pointing, crowd pointing, and 40 feet away, the bull just feet fall out from under him, and he hits the floor.
Exactly.
I mean, so there's no auto-suggestion with the bull and that far away.
That's correct.
Let's talk about, you had several occasions where you were able to receive a Shaktipat transmission, and that is an energy transmission in the Kundalini yoga school. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about who the teacher was, what the reason for you going to these. You mentioned a few interesting experiences with the aroma of the room or the feeling.
Well, I was interested in all forms of meditation at the time, and the first one that I was most impressed with was Vipassana. The Vipassana component really didn't have anything dealing with this whole energy component that comprised a lot of the traditional yoga systems. It was a very different kind of exercise, and in fact, I remember reading some of the very basic literature about Kundalini. It was almost embarrassing. The Vipassana stuff was so much more sophisticated intellectually, and in terms of a cognitive analysis of how you sort of break down different components of how the mind works and how you can alter that through various practices, forms of attention and concentration, and again, using insight as a modality. But at the same time, the Kundalini thing, it would also emphasize a goal associated with it, sort of a universal state of oneness with God or whatever. There would be a merging of the individual with the larger reality. But it so happened at the time that out of more intellectual curiosity, I ended up going to a seminar where a fellow claimed to be practicing Kundalini yoga. I really didn't know anything much about it.
What year and who was the person?
I'm trying to think of the year. I think it was, it had to be like 1970. We're talking like 50 years ago. It's hard to imagine. I think it was like 19 or 20 at the time. And I met with this fellow. He gave a brief lecture for about 15 minutes, then provided you with a specific technique he wanted you to practice to try to raise the Kundalini, which was part of the goal of the practice. The Kundalini idea was that there was this vital force that was subliminal within the body, sort of housed at the base of the spine, and that the goal of the practice was through concentration and breathing and different movements to sort of raise this, what they call the serpent power, up the spine, have it go up the spine and up to the top of the head. And by virtue of doing that, you were able to enter this exalted state of consciousness, generally known in terms of yoga samadhi, union with God. And this particular fellow, his name was Rudrananda. He was well known as, I think there were about maybe 10 people at this small meeting. This is, again, before internet. So I went to the seminar and decided I'd try it, more out of an intellectual curiosity than anything else. That was my first exposure to it. I then subsequently met...
Now, hold on. So what was the experience that you felt during that? How did it occur? Did you feel a Kundalini rising? Did you feel an energy in your abdomen or low back, in the sacrum? You know, how was he... You had told me in the past about him, like, pointing his feet at people and them having
Well, during that initial meeting that I had with him, there really wasn't much of anything that I experienced. It was a very simplistic breathing exercise that was done.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a 1-2-step kind of thing.
Right.
And you visualize the idea of having a sensation of some kind of energy current go up your spine. And I didn't experience much of anything with it. But, more as an academic exercise, I said, I'm practicing all these other techniques. Why don't I include what he's recommending as a foundation of his particular tradition? Went home, and every day for about 20, 30 minutes, I actually forced myself to sit down or to, get into a seated yoga lotus position or half lotus position and practice a particular breathing exercise. And again, it was something that was like the entire exercise itself would take about, maybe about a minute, half a minute to a minute to do it. And you just repeat this exercise over and over again. And hopefully it would trigger some kind of reaction in the body, and that you would have some of this advanced conscious experience that the classical literature said was a result of doing this kind of yoga. Not all forms of yoga have Kundalini as part of the practice. There's some that are Jnana yoga, which is sort of more of an intellectual, cognitive kind of thing, and some emphasize more some of the breathing practices. Some have athletic activities, some have sexual practices supposedly designed to trigger this kind of thing. But the goal in that particular tradition was to trigger this underlying force that would alter your perception of yourself and what you experienced.
How many times did you meet with him?
I think total of maybe 3 times. I think I went to a second time where they did exactly the same thing. You had an opportunity on the weekend to go and sit with a bunch of people and practice this technique. He had an ashram up in center up in New York, and so I remember going away for a weekend to go to that center. But I did practice the exercise, and I had a very unusual experience with exercise. But I should point out, I was a non-believer. I still felt, when I read all this literature, and people were studying, doing EEGs and cardiovascular explorations and different kinds of, instrumentation, biofeedback, and stuff like that. They were basically doing brainwave studies, and they found that they were claiming at the time that you could train with biofeedback and get into an alpha state, experience the same thing that these meditators spent 20, 30, 40 years trying to get to, that they equated the brainwave activity for somebody in a laboratory to the same kind of brainwaves that an advanced Zen practitioner would report having. Again, assuming that the consciousness experiences were the same. From my point of view, they definitely were not the same at all. But at that time, that was early investigations trying to understand what was really going on.
What was the situation with Rudrananda? You said he would lean back and point his, open his legs and point his feet at people, and they would fall over. And
well, he had mastered this technique of giving Shaktipat, which is transmission of Shakti, or the energy in his body, to a disciple. The disciple would sort of look up to the guru as his teacher. There was this emphasis upon being open and open to the divinity of the teacher or the guru, and that by being open, emotionally and in terms of your heart and your felt sense of self, that you could experience oneness with that guru, that he would transmit that energy from his body into that other person's body, and that they would begin, that would sort of cultivate or plant the seed that they would be able to eventually develop the same kind of energy and experience of consciousness.
So you didn't feel it that way with him, but doing the exercise that he taught, the breathing and pump like.
Yeah, I actually, as a disbeliever, I didn't approach this in the same way that I think a lot of other people did. I approached it as I wanted to learn something new about it, so I felt I had to practice something in order to come to some conclusion of whether we were dealing with something legitimate or with some sort of exaggerated state of consciousness. What these guys claim is like an expanded state of awareness. I forced myself to sit down for 20 minutes and do it. It's not the attitude you should have with meditation. I wanted to learn it as a technique. I forced myself to sit down. I rehearsed this technique every day, 5 days a week. Well, I did that for like 2 weeks, and at the end of or part of the second week, I remember, again, a little bit frustrated because nothing was really happening at all. And I remember kind of coming to at the end of my 20 or 30-minute session, and as I was preparing to sort of like exit from a lotus sitting position, all of a sudden I had this dramatic electric shock that shot up my spine from my base of from my tailbone into my head, shot into my brain, and it's like I had an orgasm in my brain. It's the only sensation that was similar to it time that I could think of as a parallel was, this is the kind of experience I have during a sexual orgasm, but it's happening in the context in the center of my brain. And I was like shocked. It's like the image that I had was not religious. Like people talk about having, encounters with the divine and feeling one with God or whatever. I felt like I'd actually thrust through like a torpedo through a glass pane and it like crashed. And it's like I couldn't think. There was sort of a white, like a brilliance, a sense of brilliance around me. Thoughts had ceased, and I'm having sort of an orgasmic experience where it all happened simultaneously at the time, and it lasted for perhaps, I'm going to say, 5 or 10 seconds. At the same time, I'm having these convulsions, almost like I'm having a seizure attack, and body spontaneously going through these like a snake crawling up, and I can understand the imagery after having had that experience. And then it's like I came down within 5 seconds or whatever, and I went, "Holy shit, what was that?" I actually fell over. I couldn't stand up. I fell over as this was happening, and I went, "Wow, this is clearly something that I could not have imagined would ever happen." I realized that when they were talking about having this advanced state of awareness and dramatic experience, that's what I had, but I'd only had it for like about 5 seconds. I didn't know what to say. I mean, at that point, I said, "This is the real deal. This thing is like more than what I could imagine." An orgasm in your brain is quite dramatic as compared to an orgasm in your groin.
Right. The Shaktipat experience with Swami Muktananda.
I went to 2 other guys at the same time that I had this one. I actually wrote a paper on it for Noetic Sciences. At that point, I was saying this whole idea of a gradualistic thing that you found with most of the way the teachings were done, particularly with the mindfulness stuff, that there's this whole other area that was really completely ignored, that you could have dramatic experiences like this. This involved sort of the body discipline in a way that was different from Vipassana and the way that you look at body sensations or whatever. Because the experience was so pleasurable, I repeated the exercise. And it took a number of years, actually, even though I was able to do this and affect this, let's say, 5 to 10 second, maybe up to a 30 seconds time frame of having these experiences several times a week. To have it permanently lock in, it wasn't happening. I could only do it momentarily as a result of this. You did this breathing exercises. You kind of took some deep breaths in. You inhaled. You held the breath. You visualized that the breath was going down into the tantien or the stomach area, and then you sort of rocked a little bit on the back of your spine, the tailbone, and then hopefully there would be sort of this reaction as a result of sort of pumping up the energy, like blowing up a flat tire. You take the pump, you sort of prime it, we do it over and over again, and eventually it reaches a point where it can't contain the pressure anymore, and it explodes. This was sort of an explosion up the spine by cultivating this hydraulic technique.
Right. If we go back to an earlier bit of this conversation where you talk about after you've achieved something, you have the cultivation stage.
Yes.
So you had to cultivate this practice over and over and over in order to get it to become permanent. But I want to get back to if you could give us a description of the encounters with Rudrananda and Maliszewski.
Well, there are three guys that claim to be experts of transferring the energy via Shaktipat, claim to have this as part of their tradition and part of their practice. I happen to be able to go to seminars and that lasted for several days with each of those folks, and I was curious from an intellectual point of view, especially after having this experience myself, how these guys were different. And I did sort of a comparative analysis. I looked at the personality of the individual. I looked at the specific practices that were done. The Kundalini thing was more sort of viewed as a secondary thing. The second fellow that I heard about that was practicing this particular technique was Swami Muktananda. His system was known as Siddha Yoga, Siddha. He talked about raising the Kundalini in the same fashion that Rudrananda had. Muktananda had much larger groups at the time, and I remember when he was presenting his system to you, they would have chanting. He would be sitting at the front of an auditorium. He probably had several hundred people. There would be recitation of mantras. My experience with this was very different from what I had with Rudrananda. There was no specific technique that was designed to be the central focus of how you did this. You basically sat in front of the guru, and the guru imparted his energy to everybody who was in the auditorium or in that setting. The guru would generate a fog through a foggy area, and it's sort of like the fog envelops you. That's the kind of sensation I had with Muktananda. You basically would be meditating. Eventually, you're starting, as you're breathing and you're doing this exercise, your eyes are usually closed. You started feeling like you're getting high. And as you're breathing it in, you're getting higher and higher, and you're feeling like an ecstatic feeling in your body. Some people had spontaneous kriyas, which are the shaking associated with the Kundalini rising. Some would just sort of like fall over. They would kind of go in sort of a trance state or whatever. And I will tell you this is like having a high-dose LSD experience, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
I had several encounters. I did several LSD trips when I was in college just to see what it was like. Certainly mind-altering, dramatic. Those sessions lasted, I don't know, they lasted anywhere from 8 to 12 hours when I had them. I only had like 3 or 4 of them, but they were pretty much very positive and very mind-expanding. Muktananda's thing was essentially the same thing, but you didn't take any drugs. The impact of whatever energy he emitted, which was global, he's dealing with this with 100 people. He basically transmitted a high-dose LSD experience into the individuals that were there. And basically you were there to sort of worship the guru and surrender to the guru's grace. He described it as a grace that he transmitted to you. It penetrated into your body, and if you were receptive, your heart was open, your mind was open, you would get high in the same way. It was like this is what it was all about. So it was very different in terms of the format. His energy was 10 times stronger than what Rudrananda did. Rudrananda was focused. I didn't mention it earlier, but he had a thing where he could like point he could point his feet at you or his hand at you, and he could, you could feel the energy hit you. Muktananda's again was global, like a fog. I did have one experience with him, and I remember he was walking down a hallway once, and I was standing there, and I said, they all emphasize surrendering to the guru, and I went along with the idea like I'm surrendering like there's some force greater than myself, and I'm going to open myself to the experience of this person with my heart. So he's walking by me, and he sees me staring at him, and it was only a momentary glance, but he looked at me, and he shot, I had the sensation, he shot energy out of his eyes, and it hit my abdomen area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like instantaneous. He didn't say a word. It's like he sent laser beams from his eyes into my abdomen, and I felt almost like something like the size of a basketball filled my abdomen and then sort of traveled up to the top of my head. It's like somebody threw a hand grenade at you and it exploded in your body and it penetrated your whole body. That's the only image I can give you with it.
Now, what was your experience with Maliszewski?
He was actually, as an individual, he was the most impressive of the bunch, in the sense of a guy that was kind of very low-key, very little ego.
Right.
He's very slender. One thing that was kind of interesting, he's an older guy. He claimed to be over 100 years of age, but you didn't really know because they didn't keep records at that time. And I was in my 30s, I think, when I saw him, either mid-20s or late 20s or early 30s. He would, before he would do any of the meditative exercises, he would have people go for a walk with him. And this guy had so much energy when he walked, I couldn't keep up with him. I had to be at like a semi-trot.
Wow.
Beside him in order to keep up with the pace at which he was able to walk. The other interesting thing that he was older and he had white hair and a beard.
Mm-hmm.
Part of his practice, he started growing black hair on the right side of his head above his ear. And I looked at him and says, what's that all about? He says, oh, no, the color in my hair has resumed to my original color of black, but only in that one area. It was just kind of an unusual, freakish kind of thing that I saw.
Right.
Now, he also, like Rudrananda at that time, had very small number of disciples. I think that maybe there were 15 or 20 people that would go to his meetings. He had small groups, and he would go around, and people would be meditating. And his approach was to take the palm of his hand, and as you're down beneath him, as he's walking around, he would place the palm of his hand on top of your head, and he claimed to be transmitting his energy, divine energy of Shakti, into the body of the people who were meditating and who were his disciples. I should also say that Muktananda had, as a contrast, he used to hit people with a peacock feather. He used to transmit the energy occasionally. He would go walking around and hit you with a peacock feather, supposedly the energy traveling from his hand into the peacock feather, and would then, at the end of the peacock feather, would go into your head or into your body.
That's just quite impressive.
Yeah.
How he traveled around to find the teachers, forever left his family. I mean, his biography is quite thick and quite detailed.
Muktananda had an earlier...
he had a lot of books.
He had a lot of books and stuff. Rudrananda only wrote, I think, one or two. He wrote a small, like 2 or 3 books. He actually studied under Muktananda, and they had a falling out. The way in which they transmitted the energy, it wasn't congruent with who they were as personality individuals or in terms of their ego or whatever. The one with the least amount of ego was the one that had the least amount of energy. And that was Maliszewski.
Mm-hmm.
He struck me as being able to read more deeply into the workings of the individual he was transmitting to than any of these other guys.
Yeah. According to his biography, House on Fire, he would go around and give Shaktipat to hundreds and hundreds of people at a time, and would give it so freely to help elevate the Indian, population in India, that he would be absolutely exhausted and drained and sleep for 3 months at a time. So it could be when he came to California that it was a time of just being exhausted.
Yeah, I didn't see the biography until much later. I haven't actually read the entire thing either.
Right.
I do know, I could tell that he did have some legitimate experience. He seemed to be very real. He was the most impressive as a humble individual, genuine. And again, I wrote this up in an article doing sort of a comparative analysis.
Right.
The thing is a lot of people could go through all of this stuff, but it didn't always take for everybody.
Right.
And part of what I'm writing up about in the meditation book is what are the criteria that's required as a recipient to magnify this, and how does it compare to some of the? I always had an interest in other traditions to see how did they end up experiencing these things differently. Were the outcomes the same? Were they different? Again, the path is different. You have, again, gradual enlightenment, sudden enlightenment, gradual cultivation, sudden cultivation. You have these different formulas which people really have not looked at. I was interested in it because my experience with the Kundalini thing was like a sudden enlightenment and then gradual cultivation, but that concept does not exist historically in any of the textual stuff that I came across with respect to yoga traditions like that. That happened to be my response to it. I viewed it as neurophysiological, didn't have any specific strong spiritual content to it. It wasn't a lot of wish fulfillment. It was a reaction. It's like you're engaging in sex and you're going to have an orgasm. If you pursue go through the sexual stages of, the sexual response cycle, you're going to have a reaction at the end. And it was more like that. I don't think a lot of people that had the Shaktipat had that kind of experience that way. I think that my images is that it's filtered with most people, and particularly if you look at the seminars and the YouTube folks doing it now. I mean, there's some where the guru does touch the person in a certain part of their body, their forehead, top of the head, or another part of their body. But you also get some where I think it sort of merges in through and you may get a reaction with it, where the Kundalini thing does shoot up the spine. But you can get high where you're not actually feeling like the energy rushing up your spine.
Right. That's very interesting because, as you know, I struggle with that. I've seen so many teachers, QiGong experiences, healing experiences, all through my travels. And I don't have those visceral feelings in my body. You know, I feel good when I'm done. I feel relaxed. I feel like the pain levels are down. But I never feel like energy moving in my body or moving up my spine. And it's frustrating for me, you know. And I know I have a lot of psychological armor from my life. You know, part of me believes it's fake because I don't have the experience, but the other part says, look at all the people having the experiences, and it's got to be real. I mean, I see a lot of weird stuff, a lot of unbelievable stuff. I just want to have those feelings myself.
Well, I actually take exception to what you're saying. I actually think you've gone through the processes. We've talked about it before. We know some of the same people that have transmitted that type of experience to you. I think it's buried in your body. It just hasn't manifested yet.
Oh, right. You know, because we both reported seeing Muktananda's pearl floating in front of our visual space when we're in the shower.
Muktananda had this one. If you read some of his books, as I recall them, he said that to show the advanced stage of his particular practice, you would see a blue pearl in your field of vision. I ended up seeing this blue pearl. I was taking a shower once, and the shower stall had white panels around the corner where I'm standing, and all of a sudden I'm looking at in front of me, like about maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches in front, and I see this like blue pearl sort of just materialize in front of me. It was there only momentarily, and it would disappear. Mm-hmm. But to be honest with you, even though he claimed to me that was sort of a recognition or an illumination or reflection of a level of experience, I didn't experience any ecstatic thing or whatever with it. I just saw that as an external visualization, which I completely forgotten about. I didn't think that I think that what happened by the time that I spent with him, that his phenomenon penetrated my body, and whatever he experiences, his blue pearl was sort of transmitted to me. I feel that whatever is experienced in this guru's gets transmitted to the other person's body, and part of that phenomenon of what they experience is cultivated and reflected by that individual. It's part of the transmission.
And that's interesting because in the mid-90s, you transmitted energy to me, never mentioned the pearl, and it wasn't until about, 6 years ago that I said, all of a sudden, I said, hey, Mike, I was taking a shower and this blue pearl appeared in front of my face.
Yeah, I know, it's kind of it's a weird experience, but it's real.
Yeah, but you had never mentioned it to me, or been in a room with Muktananda's energy in the 70s or 80s. You transferred it to me in the mid-90s, and then in 23, so 2018 or 2017, all of a sudden I see this blue pearl and call you up and like, hey, I saw this pearl, and you're like, yeah, that's part of the Muktananda thing. But again, I didn't feel anything with it either. It was
let me tell you what I think. I remember thinking at the time, and I don't know, all these guys into consciousness are into evolutionary theories. I don't know enough about them, and I think it's sort of it's like reading a comic book. I mean, this is what I think has happened. You had this theory of evolution, and again, I'm speaking out of ignorance here. You had your contrast Lamarckian thing, inheritance of acquired characteristics. I remember that phraseology. I think what happens here is actually an inheritance of acquired experience that is transmitted to you. I think that actually happens. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. I just know that I had the blue pearl, you had the blue pearl. I was doing energy transmissions with people, and in some cases, people just being near me would end up having these experiences that I never discussed with them before. But later on, they would say, I had this experience, and I would know what it is because that's what I have in my head, in my consciousness. The only other thing I would say is that the Kundalini system is only one of many meditative traditions. It's not mutually exclusive. It doesn't contain everything. There's no system out there that contains everything, and I think in future podcasts we'll end up seeing that there's a lot of variability, a lot of which maybe the public has not even been aware of.
You know, we have so much more to talk about, but we're going to have to do it on another podcast. That when you were in India and the guy knocks out a chicken by touching one of the marma points or points on the chicken, I want to talk to you about your meeting, one-on-one interview with the Dalai Lama. I want to talk to you about ghosts and aliens and people communicating from the other side, and also your paradigm of meditation and states of consciousness that you've been developing over, the last 30 to 40 years. So we're going to catch that on the next one. Man, this conversation was so great. I know our listeners are going to love it and hopefully connect in and ask some questions. I'm going to make some of the literature that you mentioned available in the notes below where people can find it. We didn't even talk about your time at the largest single-site headache clinic in the world, treating 20,000 patients a year with alternative methods. And that's something to talk to you about as well, because, you wrote a book about it called The Headache Solution. I appreciate you giving that time to us.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, Mark.
And we'll catch you next time.
All right, sounds good. Have a great one. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.